The rise of the first multinational megacorporation began during one of the most transformative periods in global history. In the late 16th and early 17th centuries, European nations were fiercely competing for control of the world's most profitable trade routes. Among the goods that drove this competition, spices were the most valuable. Nutmeg, cloves, pepper, cinnamon, and mace were not simply cooking ingredients in Europe. They were luxury commodities used for medicine, food preservation, perfume, and even religious rituals. A small bag of spices could be worth a fortune. The center of this trade was Southeast Asia, particularly the islands that now belong to Indonesia. These islands produced rare spices that grew nowhere else on Earth. European merchants had been trying to reach these markets for decades, first through land routes and later through long and dangerous sea voyages. For many years, the Portuguese dominated this trade after opening the sea route around Africa in the late 15th century. But by the late 1500s, a new maritime power was rising in Europe. The young Republic of the Netherlands had recently fought for independence from Spain and was quickly becoming a powerful trading nation. Dutch merchants saw enormous opportunity in the Asian spice trade. However, early Dutch expeditions to Asia faced serious problems. Different groups of merchants organized their own voyages independently. These separate expeditions often competed with each other, driving up costs and reducing profits. Instead of strengthening Dutch influence overseas, this internal competition weakened it. Realizing the danger of this situation, the Dutch government decided to take a revolutionary step. In 1602, it united these competing merchant groups into a single powerful corporation. That company became the Dutch East India Company. The creation of this corporation changed the history of global commerce forever. Unlike previous trading ventures, this new organization was granted extraordinary authority. The Dutch government gave it powers normally reserved for sovereign states. The company could build forts, establish colonies, negotiate treaties with foreign rulers, wage wars, maintain armies, and operate its own navy. This meant the corporation was not simply a trading company. It was a powerful political and military force operating across oceans. The headquarters of the company were located in the thriving commercial city of Amsterdam. At that time, Amsterdam was becoming the financial center of Europe. The city's merchants, bankers, and shipbuilders were among the most experienced traders in the world. To fund its massive operations, the company introduced a revolutionary financial system. It sold shares of ownership to investors. Anyone with sufficient wealth could purchase a portion of the company and receive a share of its profits. This innovation effectively created one of the first modern stock markets. Investors could buy and sell company shares, spreading financial risk among thousands of participants. This allowed the company to raise enormous amounts of capital quickly. The success of this financial model gave the corporation a huge advantage over its competitors. Instead of relying solely on royal funding or small merchant partnerships, it could gather money from across society. Wealthy merchants, bankers, craftsmen, and even middle-class citizens invested their savings into the enterprise. With this financial power, the company began building a vast fleet of ships designed for long-distance voyages. These ships sailed thousands of miles from Europe to Asia, carrying silver, weapons, and trade goods. The journey itself was incredibly dangerous. Ships had to travel around the southern tip of Africa, cross the vast Indian Ocean, and navigate unfamiliar waters filled with storms and pirates. Many sailors died from disease, shipwrecks, or malnutrition. Yet the potential profits were so enormous that investors continued to fund these voyages despite the risks. When the ships finally returned to Europe, they carried cargo that could be sold for extraordinary sums. Spices purchased cheaply in Asia could be sold in European markets at prices many times higher. The corporation soon became one of the most profitable enterprises in the world. But the company's ambitions did not stop at simple trade. Its leaders understood that controlling supply was far more profitable than merely buying and selling goods. If the company could dominate the regions where spices were grown, it could control global prices and eliminate competition.
This strategy required building a network of fortified trading posts across Asia. These outposts would serve as warehouses, military bases, and administrative centers. Over time, the company established dozens of these stations across the Indian Ocean and Southeast Asia. Each outpost expanded the company's influence while protecting its commercial interests. One of the most important developments occurred in 1619 when the company established a major colonial headquarters in the city of Batavia. Built on the island of Java, Batavia quickly became the center of the company's Asian empire. From Batavia, company governors managed trade routes, military operations, and diplomatic negotiations with local rulers. The city itself grew rapidly into a bustling colonial capital. Ships arrived from across Asia bringing textiles, porcelain, silk, tea, and spices. Merchants from China, India, and the Middle East gathered in its markets. For the corporation, Batavia was more than just a port. It was the command center of a commercial empire stretching across thousands of miles. Within a few decades, the company had transformed itself into something the world had never seen before. It was a corporation operating across continents, managing global trade routes, commanding military forces, and controlling territories far from its homeland. By the middle of the 17th century, the company had become the most powerful trading organization on Earth. Its fleets sailed across the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. Its warehouses were filled with goods worth fortunes. Its investors received enormous dividends. To many observers in Europe, the company seemed unstoppable. Yet beneath this extraordinary success, hidden weaknesses were already beginning to develop. The corporation's massive size created complex bureaucracies that were difficult to manage. Communication between Asia and Europe could take months. Corruption among distant officials was becoming increasingly common. And while the company controlled the spice trade, other European powers were slowly building their own commercial empires. The rise of this global corporation had been spectacular, but the forces that would eventually lead to its dramatic fall were already beginning to take shape. The story of that fall would become one of the most fascinating economic dramas in world history.
After its founding in 1602, the Dutch East India Company moved quickly to transform its early trading expeditions into a powerful system of control over the spice-producing regions of Asia. The leaders of the company understood that simply buying spices from local traders would never produce the level of wealth they envisioned. True power required something far greater. It required control of the supply itself. During the early 17th century, the most valuable spices in the world came from a small group of islands scattered across what is now Indonesia. These islands were the only place on Earth where nutmeg and cloves grew naturally. European demand for these spices was enormous. In the markets of Amsterdam, London, and Paris, spices could be sold for prices that were many times higher than their purchase cost in Asia. Company directors realized that if they could dominate these islands and prevent competitors from accessing them, they could effectively control global spice prices. This strategy became the foundation of the corporation's early expansion. To implement this plan, fleets of heavily armed ships began sailing from the Netherlands toward Southeast Asia. These ships were not only merchant vessels, but also floating fortresses equipped with cannons and soldiers. Their mission was clear: secure trade routes, establish fortified ports, and eliminate rival traders. The first major step in building this empire was establishing a permanent base in Asia. In 1619, the company captured and rebuilt a port city on the island of Java. That city became Batavia. Batavia quickly became the center of the company's Asian operations. From this powerful headquarters, governors directed fleets, negotiated treaties, and coordinated military campaigns across the region. Massive warehouses were constructed to store spices before they were shipped to Europe. Shipyards built and repaired vessels for the long voyages across the oceans. Within a few years, Batavia transformed into one of the busiest trading ports in Asia.
Merchants from China, India, Arabia, and Southeast Asia arrived to trade goods such as silk, porcelain, tea, textiles, and precious metals. But the most important cargo passing through the city remained spices. To maintain their monopoly, the company focused on gaining control of the small islands where nutmeg and cloves were grown. Among the most valuable were the Banda Islands. These islands were the world's primary source of nutmeg. The corporation believed that if it could dominate the Banda Islands, it could control the entire global nutmeg market. To achieve this goal, company forces began constructing forts and military outposts on the islands. Local rulers were pressured into signing exclusive trade agreements. These agreements required that farmers sell their entire spice harvest only to the Dutch company. At first, some island leaders agreed to these terms in exchange for protection and trade opportunities. However, many farmers and merchants resisted the company's monopoly. They continued selling spices to traders from other nations whenever possible. The company responded with increasingly aggressive tactics. Ships patrolled the surrounding seas to intercept unauthorized traders. If plantations were discovered selling spices to rivals, they could be destroyed. This policy of strict control eventually turned the Spice Islands into tightly regulated economic zones controlled almost entirely by the corporation. Meanwhile, the company expanded its trading network across the region. Strategic ports were established in key locations that allowed the corporation to control important shipping routes. One of these was Malacca, located along a narrow strait that connected the Indian Ocean with the South China Sea. Any ship traveling between these regions had to pass through this route, making it one of the most important trade corridors in the world. By controlling Malacca, the company gained influence over a massive portion of Asian maritime commerce. Another important outpost was established in Nagasaki in Japan. During the 17th century, Japan limited most contact with foreign nations, but Dutch merchants were allowed to trade under strict supervision. This gave the company access to Japanese silver and other valuable goods. Through these outposts, the corporation gradually constructed a trade network stretching from the Middle East to East Asia. Ships moved constantly between ports, carrying spices, textiles, metals, ceramics, and luxury goods. Information about market prices and political developments also traveled along these routes. Communication between Asia and Europe remained slow, often taking many months. Despite this challenge, the company managed to coordinate a complex system of global trade that connected continents. The profits generated by this network were enormous. Cargo purchased cheaply in Asia could be sold in European markets for extraordinary prices. Investors in the Netherlands began receiving large dividend payments, which further increased the company's popularity. More citizens invested their money in the corporation, strengthening its financial resources. By the middle of the 17th century, the company had become one of the richest organizations on Earth. Its ships dominated trade routes across the Indian Ocean. Its forts guarded strategic ports. Its warehouses were filled with valuable goods from across Asia. To many Europeans, the company appeared unstoppable. Yet this rapid expansion also created new problems. Maintaining fleets, armies, and colonial administrations across thousands of miles required enormous expenses. Local populations often resented the company's monopoly policies. Rival European powers were watching closely and preparing their own commercial empires. The corporation had achieved unprecedented power in global trade. But the methods used to secure that power would eventually create tensions and challenges that the company would struggle to control. Those tensions would become even more dangerous as new competitors entered the race for global dominance. The financial innovations of the Dutch East India Company were as revolutionary as its military and commercial strategies. When the company was founded, it introduced one of the first modern systems of publicly traded shares.
Investors from across the Netherlands could buy ownership in the corporation, entitling them to a portion of its profits. This system transformed the way people thought about business, risk, and wealth. Before the VOC, trade ventures were usually small and limited to a few partners or under the patronage of a monarch. The corporation, however, allowed thousands of people to pool their resources. A single voyage could cost tens of thousands of guilders, an enormous sum at the time, and spreading this financial risk across numerous shareholders made such ventures feasible. Trading of VOC shares took place in the bustling city of Amsterdam. Merchants, bankers, and citizens gathered to buy and sell shares based on expectations of profits from distant voyages. Prices of these shares fluctuated according to rumors of shipwrecks, piracy, successful trade returns, or political events in Asia. For the first time, ordinary citizens could participate directly in global commerce, hoping for fortunes from the company's successes. This financial model created unprecedented opportunities. Even a small investment in VOC shares could yield enormous dividends if a voyage returned successfully. During the 17th century, some investors became incredibly wealthy through the company. Stories of fortunes made overnight spread across Europe, fueling further investment and the rise of a new class of financial elites. The VOC also pioneered bookkeeping and corporate governance methods that were far more sophisticated than anything else at the time. A central board, known as the Heren 17, oversaw the corporation's operations from Amsterdam. Each director managed a specific region or function, while regional governors in Asia controlled day-to-day operations, trade negotiations, and military decisions. This hierarchical structure allowed the company to manage trade routes spanning thousands of miles, but it also created challenges. Communication delays meant that orders sent from Amsterdam could take months to reach Asian outposts. By the time instructions arrived, local conditions often had changed, forcing regional governors to make independent decisions. The VOC's financial system and governance allowed it to expand aggressively into lucrative markets. Spices, textiles, silk, porcelain, and precious metals flowed through its trading network, enriching both the corporation and the Dutch state. The Netherlands became one of the world's wealthiest nations, thanks in large part to the company's success. Amsterdam emerged as a center of global finance, with banks, merchants, and brokers facilitating the massive flow of goods and capital. However, this financial complexity carried inherent risks. Corruption among officials became increasingly common. Local governors and merchants sometimes engaged in private trade, diverting profits to themselves instead of the company. Record-keeping errors and manipulation of accounts occasionally concealed losses or illegal activities. As the corporation grew, these problems became more difficult to monitor. Moreover, the VOC's reliance on long-distance trade made it vulnerable to unforeseen disasters. Ships could be lost to storms, disease could decimate crews, and political conflicts could disrupt trade routes. Any single catastrophe could wipe out months or years of investment. Yet the structure of publicly traded shares helped absorb these shocks. Losses were spread across thousands of investors rather than falling on a single owner. Despite these challenges, the company thrived. By the mid-17th century, it had established itself as the dominant trading power in Asia. Its control over the spice trade allowed it to manipulate global prices. Nutmeg, cloves, and mace, grown on the small islands of the Indonesian archipelago, became incredibly valuable commodities. Through strategic monopolies, military enforcement, and clever diplomacy, the VOC kept competitors at bay and maximized profits. The corporation's success also demonstrated the power of global commerce as a tool of statecraft. The line between government and business became blurred. The VOC could negotiate treaties, wage wars, and govern territories, all while operating as a private company. It set a precedent for the future of multinational corporations, showing how private enterprise could exert influence on a scale previously reserved for nation-states. Yet beneath the company's apparent invincibility, structural weaknesses were accumulating. Corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, and the difficulty of managing far-flung operations created vulnerabilities. Competition from emerging European powers, such as the British East India Company and the French East India Company, threatened the VOC's monopoly. Over time, these vulnerabilities would contribute to a decline as dramatic as its rise. The financial brilliance of the VOC, combined with its pioneering governance, had made it a global powerhouse. But the same factors that fueled its growth, the distance, complexity, and human ambition, would also set the stage for its eventual unraveling. Its story of its empire, both economic and political, would continue to unfold in Asia, shaping global trade and leaving lessons that resonate even centuries later.
By the mid-17th century, the Dutch East India Company had transformed into a corporate empire of unprecedented scale. Its fleets patrolled the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea, linking Europe to Asia and connecting markets that had once been isolated by vast oceans. The VOC's reach extended from the Spice Islands in Southeast Asia to ports in India, Ceylon, and Japan. Its influence was so powerful that it often acted like a sovereign state in the territories it controlled. The city of Batavia served as the administrative and military heart of the VOC's Asian empire. From Batavia, company governors coordinated trade, diplomacy, and military operations across thousands of miles. Massive warehouses were built to store spices, textiles, porcelain, and other valuable goods. Shipyards repaired and constructed the vessels needed to sustain long-distance commerce. Fortifications protected the city from local uprisings and rival European powers. The company's military power was as significant as its economic strength. Fleets of armed ships escorted merchant vessels, suppressed piracy, and enforced the corporation's monopolies. Soldiers stationed in outposts on key islands, such as the Banda Islands, maintained control over spice production. The VOC frequently used force to secure compliance from local populations, block competitors, and protect valuable trade routes. Control over specific commodities became the backbone of the company's wealth. Nutmeg and cloves, grown on tiny islands, were in high demand across Europe. By monopolizing these products, the VOC could dictate prices and maintain enormous profits. The company not only purchased the spices, but also tightly regulated their cultivation, distribution, and export. Unauthorized trade was met with confiscation, fines, or military intervention. The VOC's empire was not limited to the Southeast Asian archipelago. Strategic outposts were established throughout the Indian Ocean, including Malacca, which controlled access to vital maritime passages, and Colombo in Ceylon, which provided access to cinnamon and other commodities. In Japan, the port of Nagasaki allowed the company to engage in limited but highly lucrative trade under the strict supervision of the Tokugawa shogunate. These outposts were more than commercial hubs. They functioned as centers of intelligence, allowing the company to monitor rival powers, gather information about local markets, and coordinate military and diplomatic operations. Spies and informants supplied intelligence on regional politics, economic opportunities, and potential threats to the company's monopoly. The VOC's trade network connected distant regions with remarkable efficiency for the time. Ships carried silver from Japan and the Americas to pay for Asian goods, while spices, silk, porcelain, and other luxuries flowed toward European markets. Information about market conditions, commodity prices, and political developments also traveled along these networks, creating an early form of global communication. The corporation's influence extended beyond commerce. It negotiated treaties with local rulers, often securing exclusive rights to trade or territorial concessions. In some cases, these treaties effectively ceded political authority to the company.
The VOC could collect taxes, administer justice, and maintain armed forces, functions usually reserved for sovereign states. The company's success generated immense wealth. Dividends to investors were substantial, and Amsterdam became the financial heart of Europe. Merchants, bankers, and investors from across the continent participated in the VOC's operations, creating one of the first truly global financial systems. Yet this vast empire also introduced significant challenges. Managing an organization that spanned continents required sophisticated administration, but communication delays and bureaucratic inefficiencies often hindered decision-making. Regional governors in Asia had to act independently, sometimes leading to conflicts of interest or corruption. Maintaining fleets, fortifications, and colonial administrations demanded enormous resources, and the company's expenses began to rise steadily. Despite these challenges, the VOC's dominance during its golden age was undeniable. For decades, it controlled critical trade routes, commanded armed forces, and wielded political influence across Asia. Its corporate empire connected continents, dictated the flow of valuable commodities, and generated unprecedented profits. The success of the VOC set a model for future multinational corporations. It demonstrated that private enterprise could operate on a global scale, combining trade, finance, military power, and political influence. The company's dominance reshaped the economic and political landscape of the 17th century, proving that commerce alone could create empires rivaling those of traditional monarchies. Yet the very factors that enabled this dominance, complex bureaucracy, reliance on distant communication, and heavy investment in military and administrative infrastructure, would later contribute to the company's vulnerability. The seeds of its eventual decline were sown even during this period of unparalleled success, as competition, corruption, and systemic inefficiencies quietly undermined its foundations. As the 17th century progressed into the 18th, the Dutch East India Company faced mounting challenges from emerging European competitors. Nations such as England and France had developed their own East India companies, eager to secure a share of the lucrative Asian trade. Among these rivals, the British East India Company was the most formidable. Its growing fleets, strategic alliances, and expanding influence threatened the VOC's long-established monopoly. The competition forced the Dutch corporation to divert increasing resources to defense and military operations. Protecting trade routes, fortresses, and ships across the Indian Ocean became an expensive endeavor. Fleets had to be maintained, garrisons supplied, and fortifications repaired, often at great cost. Meanwhile, other European companies were not only challenging Dutch shipping lanes, but also cultivating relationships with local rulers, undermining the VOC's political leverage. The spice trade, once the primary source of enormous profits, also began to change. European demand for spices gradually stabilized as markets became saturated. While the VOC had controlled nearly all nutmeg and clove production, other commodities such as tea, coffee, cotton, and textiles were becoming increasingly valuable, often dominated by competitors. The company's continued focus on traditional spice monopolies limited its ability to adapt to these emerging markets. At the same time, the complexity of the corporation's administration became a growing liability. The VOC's governance structure, designed for rapid expansion, was now cumbersome. Orders sent from Amsterdam to Asian outposts often took months to arrive, by which time local circumstances had frequently changed. Regional governors were forced to act independently, sometimes pursuing personal interests over corporate directives. Corruption and unofficial trade became common, eroding company profits and undermining the carefully maintained monopolies. In addition to internal inefficiency, global events also disrupted the VOC's operations. European wars, such as conflicts involving the Netherlands, England, and France, directly affected trade routes and colonial possessions. Ships could be captured or destroyed, and trade agreements were often interrupted by political hostilities. Even relatively minor skirmishes in Europe had outsized impacts on commerce thousands of miles away. The rising operational costs, combined with decreasing relative profits from the spice trade, began to strain the company's finances. To maintain its empire, the VOC borrowed heavily. Loans allowed the corporation to fund fleets, fortifications, and administrative costs, but interest payments slowly consumed an increasing portion of revenue. Investors, once thrilled by steady dividends, began to notice declining returns and growing instability. Competition was not limited to European rivals. In Asia, local rulers became increasingly sophisticated in navigating the presence of foreign companies. They could play European powers against one another, securing better terms for their own regions. The VOC, despite its military strength, often had to negotiate and compromise to maintain access to key commodities. Furthermore, logistical challenges multiplied. Maintaining ships and warehouses, ensuring the health of crews, and coordinating production across thousands of miles of territory required a level of management that even the VOC's sophisticated bureaucracy struggled to deliver. Mistakes, inefficiencies, and corruption became inevitable. Although the VOC still projected enormous power, these combined pressures signaled the first cracks in its foundation. What had once seemed an invincible corporation now faced the reality that wealth, military strength, and bureaucratic innovation could not fully insulate it from competition, political change, or mismanagement. By the early 18th century, the company's dominance was no longer unchallenged. Rivals, rising operational costs, internal corruption, and changing global markets all contributed to a decline that, although gradual at first, would eventually accelerate into full-scale collapse. The stage was set for the VOC's golden age to give way to mounting financial and political pressures that would define its eventual fall, a process that would unfold over the next decades as both external and internal weaknesses converged.
By the early 18th century, internal corruption had become one of the greatest threats to the Dutch East India Company. The corporation's vast network of trading posts, fortresses, and colonies stretched across thousands of miles, making oversight nearly impossible. Thousands of employees, including merchants, soldiers, sailors, and administrators, operated with minimal supervision. While the VOC had strict rules against private trade and self-enrichment, enforcement was weak, and many officials flouted these regulations. In the key administrative centers of Batavia and other Asian outposts, company officials often engaged in private trading networks. They secretly bought and sold spices, textiles, and other commodities, diverting profits away from the corporation and into their own pockets. Some governors and senior merchants accumulated considerable personal fortunes, sometimes exceeding the value of their official salaries. The financial oversight mechanisms in Amsterdam were also insufficient to catch all forms of mismanagement. Company accountants sometimes falsified reports to hide losses or illegal activities, while others exaggerated profits to maintain investor confidence. These practices allowed corruption to persist and even flourish over decades. The corruption at the local level often had ripple effects across the entire empire. Unauthorized trade reduced the amount of spices sent to Europe, undermining the carefully managed monopolies. In some cases, soldiers and administrators formed alliances with local rulers and traders, creating unofficial commercial networks that competed with the company's official operations.
These hidden economies further eroded corporate control. At the same time, bureaucratic inefficiency added to the corporation's problems. Orders from the Heren 17 in Amsterdam could take months to reach Asian outposts, and responses often took just as long to return. Regional governors were forced to act independently, making decisions that sometimes conflicted with company policy. Miscommunication, delays, and errors became common, reducing operational efficiency and increasing costs. The combination of corruption and bureaucratic weakness created a fragile corporate structure. While the VOC's fleets and fortresses projected an image of power, behind the scenes the empire was struggling with inefficiency and mismanagement. This internal decay was compounded by rising expenses. Maintaining armed forces, repairing ships, building infrastructure, and supplying distant colonies required enormous and ongoing investment. Even as profits from the spice trade remained significant, much of the revenue was drained by corruption, theft, and administrative waste. The system that had once produced legendary returns for investors began to falter. Dividends declined, and confidence among shareholders weakened. Moreover, corruption had social and political consequences in the colonies. Local populations often resented the abuse and exploitation by company officials. The VOC's reputation as a monopolistic and sometimes brutal enforcer of trade rules fueled resentment, occasional uprisings, and resistance to Dutch authority. These tensions forced the company to spend more resources on military enforcement, creating a cycle that further strained finances. By the middle of the 18th century, the combination of internal corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, and rising operational costs had left the VOC vulnerable. While it remained a global power, the corporation's structural weaknesses were no longer minor inconveniences. They were fundamental flaws that threatened the empire's survival. The seeds of collapse were firmly in place. The very mechanisms that had allowed the company to rise, its vast bureaucracy, reliance on distant administration, and delegation of authority, now amplified its vulnerabilities. Internal decay would prove just as damaging as external competition in the decades to come. The stage was set for the VOC to enter a period of financial crisis and decline, a turning point that would ultimately lead to the dissolution of what had once been the world's most powerful multinational corporation.
By the mid-18th century, the Dutch East India Company was entering a period of mounting financial strain. Despite controlling vast territories and lucrative trade routes, the company's expenditures had begun to outpace its revenues. The cost of maintaining fleets, fortifications, and colonial administrations had grown enormously, and long-term mismanagement and corruption only amplified these problems. One of the most critical issues was debt. To finance military campaigns, rebuild aging ships, and support colonial infrastructure, the VOC borrowed heavily from private bankers and investors in Amsterdam. These loans allowed the company to continue operations in the short term, but created a long-term liability that steadily grew. Interest payments consumed a significant portion of profits, leaving less revenue available for dividends and reinvestment. The spice trade, once a seemingly endless source of wealth, had begun to stagnate. Global markets for nutmeg, cloves, and mace became saturated, and competitors, especially the British East India Company and French East India Company, found ways to circumvent the VOC's monopolies. European demand for spices was no longer skyrocketing, and profits began to decline. At the same time, operational inefficiencies continued to mount. Bureaucracy remained bloated, communication between Europe and Asia was still slow, and corruption persisted at every level of administration. Governors and merchants in Batavia and other outposts often made decisions prioritizing personal gain over company strategy, further weakening the corporation's financial stability.
Rising military costs also strained resources. The VOC faced constant threats from local resistance, pirate attacks, and rival European powers. Forts had to be maintained, garrisons paid, and fleets equipped to protect trade routes. Each of these expenses added to the growing debt burden. By the 1760s, the company's financial reports revealed a stark reality. Debts had accumulated to unprecedented levels. Loans taken decades earlier, once manageable, now required enormous payments that the company could barely cover. Attempts to raise additional capital through stock offerings were met with declining investor confidence, as dividends became smaller and the promise of easy profits faded. The debt crisis forced the VOC to make difficult decisions. Some ships were decommissioned or sold, while maintenance of infrastructure was delayed. Administrative positions were consolidated, sometimes leaving local outposts without adequate oversight. These measures temporarily reduced costs, but also weakened the company's operational effectiveness. Compounding these financial woes, global events further destabilized trade. Wars in Europe and conflicts in Asia disrupted shipping routes, delayed cargoes, and caused occasional losses of entire fleets. The corporation's inability to respond swiftly to these crises highlighted the vulnerabilities created by its immense geographic spread and bureaucratic complexity. Even as the company's decline became apparent, its reputation remained a shield. Many European investors still viewed the VOC as a symbol of Dutch power and global commerce. This perception allowed the company to continue borrowing, albeit at higher interest rates, keeping the empire afloat despite growing systemic problems. The debt crisis, however, was not a temporary setback. It was a symptom of deeper structural issues. Mismanagement, corruption, overextension, and changing global markets had combined to create a fragile financial empire. Without significant reforms, the company's decline was inevitable. By the late 18th century, the VOC's golden age had long passed. While it still controlled valuable territories and maintained a presence across Asia, the corporation's internal weaknesses and mounting debts were eroding the foundation of what had once been the most powerful multinational enterprise in history. The next phase would see the convergence of these internal problems with external pressures, setting the stage for the eventual collapse of the VOC and the absorption of its territories by state powers.
By the late 18th century, the Dutch East India Company faced mounting pressures from both internal weaknesses and external geopolitical events. Decades of mismanagement, corruption, and debt had already destabilized the corporation, but new global conflicts accelerated its decline. Wars in Europe and Asia disrupted trade routes, increased military expenses, and undermined the company's monopolies. The VOC's principal European rivals, particularly the British East India Company and the French East India Company, were increasingly aggressive. Britain and France had expanded their colonial empires and strengthened their navies, directly challenging Dutch dominance in Asian waters. The competition was not limited to commerce. It often turned into military confrontation. Naval battles, blockades, and attacks on trading posts drained the company's resources and disrupted the flow of goods. Meanwhile, Europe itself was engulfed in a series of wars that directly affected the VOC. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, 1780 to 1784, fought between the Netherlands and Britain, was particularly devastating. The Dutch fleet was outmatched, and British forces captured Dutch ships and disrupted trade. Losses of cargo, ships, and strategic ports further weakened the already financially strained corporation. Investors in Amsterdam saw dividends plummet, while the company's ability to finance operations declined rapidly. Local resistance in Asia also intensified. Populations in the Banda Islands, Java, and other territories resented the VOC's monopolistic control and harsh enforcement tactics. Rebellions and uprisings, sometimes coordinated with rival European powers, forced the company to divert soldiers and resources to maintain order. These internal conflicts further reduced profits and destabilized colonial governance. The combination of European wars, rising local resistance, and naval competition highlighted the structural weaknesses of the VOC. Its bureaucratic system, already slow and inefficient, could not respond quickly to crises. Delays in communication between Batavia and Amsterdam meant that strategic decisions were often outdated by the time they were executed. Regional governors sometimes acted independently, pursuing their own interests rather than corporate objectives, which exacerbated inefficiencies and financial losses. Debt continued to accumulate as the company borrowed to fund military campaigns, repair ships, and maintain colonial administrations. Interest payments consumed a growing portion of revenue, leaving little for reinvestment or dividends. Financial instability became chronic, shaking investor confidence and reducing the availability of new capital. Meanwhile, global trade was shifting. Other European powers were establishing direct routes to Asia, bypassing Dutch-controlled ports. Commodities such as tea, coffee, and textiles began to dominate the market, reducing the strategic importance of the traditional spice trade. The VOC's inability to adapt to these changes left it increasingly marginalized. By the 1780s, the once mighty corporation was struggling to maintain even the appearance of dominance. Its fleets were smaller and less effective, key trading posts were vulnerable, and profits were in steady decline. The combination of military defeats, debt, bureaucratic corruption, and changing global markets had created a perfect storm. The erosion of the VOC's trade dominance marked the beginning of the end. While it continued to operate for a few more decades, the company was no longer the formidable multinational power that had once controlled the flow of spices, wealth, and influence across continents. The stage was set for a final collapse, in which state intervention would replace corporate authority, and the corporation's empire would be absorbed into national hands. By the final decades of the 18th century, the Dutch East India Company was no longer the invincible global powerhouse it had been in the 17th century. Financial mismanagement, persistent corruption, mounting debt, and external pressures had created a corporation teetering on the edge of collapse. The VOC's debts had reached catastrophic levels. Interest payments alone consumed the majority of revenues, leaving insufficient funds to maintain fleets, garrisons, and trading posts. Ships were poorly maintained, and fortifications across the Asian empire fell into disrepair. Crews suffered from inadequate supplies and low morale, further reducing operational efficiency. European rivals, particularly the British East India Company, exploited the corporation's weakness. British fleets dominated critical trade routes, intercepting shipments and capturing ports that had been under Dutch control for decades. French competitors, while less influential in the region, also sought opportunities to undermine Dutch commercial dominance. The VOC's once formidable naval power was no longer sufficient to protect its vast empire. Internal corruption continued to drain the company's resources. Officials at outposts frequently conducted private trade, diverted goods, and falsified accounts. Even as the VOC's financial collapse became apparent, oversight mechanisms were too weak and too slow to correct the systemic problems. Decisions from Amsterdam arrived months too late to address urgent crises, and local governors often ignored or manipulated directives to suit personal interests.
The spice trade, the foundation of the VOC's early wealth, had lost much of its former profitability. Market saturation in Europe, combined with the rise of new commodities such as tea, coffee, and cotton, meant that nutmeg, cloves, and mace no longer generated the extraordinary profits that had once sustained the empire. The company's reliance on a shrinking niche market left it exposed to economic fluctuations and competitor innovations. By the 1790s, the corporation was effectively insolvent. Trading operations slowed, dividends ceased, and creditors demanded massive loans. The Dutch government faced mounting pressure to intervene, as the collapse of the VOC threatened not only commerce, but also the stability of Dutch colonies in Asia. In 1796, a decisive step occurred when the Dutch state began assuming control over the company's failing operations. Key territories, including the valuable ports and spice-producing islands, were gradually placed under direct government administration. Batavia, the heart of the VOC's empire, became a colonial administrative center for the Netherlands rather than a corporate headquarters. The formal dissolution of the VOC came in 1799. After nearly 2 centuries of existence, the corporation was officially disbanded. Its debts, liabilities, and assets were absorbed by the state, and shareholders were left with partial or negligible compensation. The world's first multinational megacorporation, which had once commanded continents, controlled trade routes, and generated unimaginable wealth, had vanished. The collapse of the VOC was the result of a combination of factors. Internal corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, and overextension had eroded its foundations. Global competition, shifts in market demand, and costly wars further undermined its position. The corporation's inability to adapt to changing economic and geopolitical realities ultimately led to its downfall. Despite its collapse, the VOC left a lasting legacy. It had pioneered modern corporate governance, introduced publicly traded shares, and demonstrated that private enterprise could operate on a global scale. Its innovations in finance, trade, and administration influenced generations of multinational corporations that would follow. The fall of the VOC served as a cautionary tale. Even the most powerful corporations are vulnerable to corruption, mismanagement, and the forces of global change. The story of its rise and sudden fall would become one of the most compelling chapters in the history of commerce and empire.
Following the formal collapse of the Dutch East India Company in 1799, the Dutch state faced the immense challenge of taking over an empire that had once stretched across Asia. The government inherited not only the company's assets, ports, warehouses, forts, and ships, but also its staggering debts and administrative responsibilities. What had been a private enterprise became a public colonial apparatus, marking a radical shift in how the Dutch managed their overseas possessions. One of the first priorities of the Dutch government was to stabilize financial operations. The VOC's debts were enormous, owed to hundreds of creditors in Amsterdam and beyond. The state had to negotiate repayment schedules, restructure obligations, and attempt to restore some confidence among investors who had lost fortunes. While many shareholders received only partial compensation, the government's intervention prevented a total economic collapse within the Netherlands. Administratively, the government reorganized the former VOC territories into colonial provinces under direct state control. Batavia remained the central hub for Dutch administration in Asia, but now governors were appointed by the state rather than elected by corporate directors. Colonial bureaucracy expanded, with state officials responsible for taxation, trade, legal enforcement, and military oversight. Trade practices that had once been tightly monopolized by the VOC gradually shifted under state supervision. While the government maintained some control over key commodities, including spices, it encouraged broader commercial activity to stabilize revenue. Private merchants gained more freedom to trade, and new policies were implemented to reduce the corruption and inefficiency that had plagued the VOC. Military control was also reorganized. The Dutch state assumed responsibility for the company's garrisons, forts, and fleets. Soldiers who had previously served under VOC contracts became part of a colonial army under direct governmental command. This shift allowed for more centralized strategic planning, although maintaining such forces continued to be costly. Local populations in the former VOC territories experienced significant changes under state administration. While some oppressive practices were reduced, the new colonial government still relied on strict control of strategic trade and resources. Resistance and occasional uprisings continued, reflecting decades of tension under both corporate and state rule. The transition from corporation to state control also marked a philosophical shift in global commerce. The VOC had demonstrated that a private enterprise could wield powers comparable to a nation-state, including diplomacy, military force, and territorial governance. With the company's dissolution, the Dutch state reasserted the idea that sovereignty over colonies and trade could not be left entirely to private interests. By the early 19th century, the former VOC territories were fully integrated into the Dutch colonial empire. Key trading posts in Asia remained centers of commerce, but profits were now collected by the state rather than a multinational corporation. Lessons from the VOC's successes and failures influenced European colonial policy and the management of emerging enterprises around the world. The absorption of the VOC's empire was not instantaneous. Administrators had to contend with the legacy of corruption, debt, and inefficiency. Infrastructure required repairs, and governance systems had to be restructured. Still, the Dutch government's intervention preserved Dutch influence in Asia and ensured that the former company's collapse did not result in a complete loss of colonial control. Ultimately, the VOC's dissolution and state takeover marked the end of an era in which private enterprise alone could build and sustain a global empire. Its territories became the foundation for a formal colonial administration that would endure for more than a century, shaping the course of trade, governance, and international relations in the region.
The official end of the Dutch East India Company in 1799 marked not only the conclusion of a corporate empire, but also the close of a remarkable chapter in global economic history. After nearly 2 centuries of dominance, the corporation that had once controlled vast territories, dictated the flow of spices, and shaped international trade was gone, leaving behind lessons that would resonate for generations. The dissolution of the VOC illustrated the inherent vulnerabilities of early multinational enterprises. While the company had pioneered public trading of shares, corporate governance, and large-scale maritime logistics, it had also demonstrated how corruption, bureaucratic inefficiency, and overextension could undermine even the most powerful organization. Its collapse was a warning that wealth and influence alone could not guarantee longevity without effective management and adaptation to changing circumstances. Despite its fall, the VOC's innovations left a lasting legacy. Its model of publicly traded shares laid the groundwork for modern stock markets, showing that collective investment could finance ambitious ventures spanning continents. Investors, from wealthy merchants to middle-class citizens, learned to navigate the risks and rewards of global commerce, setting the stage for centuries of capitalist development. In Asia, the VOC had reshaped political and economic landscapes. The company's monopolistic control over spices, its fortified trading posts, and its use of military power had left a deep imprint on local societies. While many of its methods were harsh and exploitative, the administrative and logistical systems it developed influenced subsequent colonial governance.
European powers studying its operations adopted similar practices when expanding their own empires. The collapse also demonstrated the limits of private power in global affairs. The VOC had once operated with powers comparable to a sovereign state, negotiating treaties, maintaining armies, and ruling territories. Its failure underscored that even the most sophisticated corporate structures were ultimately vulnerable to political changes, economic shifts, and global competition. State intervention, as executed by the Dutch government, became necessary to stabilize and manage the empire once the corporation could no longer do so. Financial historians often cite the VOC as the first example of a multinational megacorporation in world history. Its rise showed how private enterprise could link continents, coordinate enormous resources, and generate immense wealth. Its fall revealed the dangers of mismanagement, overextension, and corruption, lessons that remain relevant in the management of modern multinational corporations. The VOC's story also influenced the development of global trade networks. By establishing permanent outposts across Asia, it created infrastructure that later governments and private enterprises could utilize. Ports like Batavia, historical name of Jakarta, Malacca, and Colombo continued to serve as hubs of commerce long after the company's dissolution. Its ships, accounting systems, and administrative practices became templates for future enterprises navigating the complex world of international trade. Ultimately, the VOC's official end represented both a conclusion and a beginning. While the corporation itself ceased to exist, the concepts it pioneered, joint stock investment, global logistics, corporate governance, and state-corporate interaction, continued to influence commerce, finance, and imperial policy for centuries. Its story remains a testament to the possibilities and perils of corporate power on a global scale.
The legacy of the Dutch East India Company extends far beyond its immediate economic and political impact. Though it ceased to exist in 1799, the corporation left enduring lessons for modern commerce, finance, and global enterprise. Its rise and sudden fall demonstrate both the potential and the peril inherent in multinational operations, and its influence can still be traced in today's corporate and financial systems. One of the most significant contributions of the VOC was the creation of the modern stock market. By selling shares to the public, the company allowed investors to participate in global trade, spreading financial risk across thousands of stakeholders. This system not only financed its ambitious maritime and military operations, but also laid the foundation for future joint stock companies, investment banks, and the international capital markets that dominate today's economy. Concepts such as dividends, share trading, and shareholder accountability trace their origins back to practices pioneered by the VOC. The corporation also demonstrated the power of scale. Its global operations spanned continents, connecting Europe, Africa, and Asia through a complex web of trade routes, warehouses, and fortified ports. It showed that private enterprises could wield influence comparable to nation-states, negotiating treaties, commanding armies, and administering territories. This model foreshadowed the rise of modern multinational corporations capable of shaping global commerce, politics, and society. At the same time, the VOC's decline provides enduring warnings. Bureaucratic inefficiency, corruption, and overextension eroded its power over time. The company struggled to adapt to changing markets, emerging competitors, and political instability. These vulnerabilities illustrate that even the most powerful organizations are subject to systemic risk, mismanagement, and external pressures. Modern corporations still grapple with similar challenges when operating across diverse international markets. Culturally and historically, the VOC left a deep imprint on the regions where it operated.
Cities like Batavia, now Jakarta, Malacca, and Colombo became enduring centers of commerce, administration, and cultural exchange. The corporation's policies, military campaigns, and trade practices reshaped local economies, societies, and political structures, often leaving legacies of both development and exploitation. The company also influenced global commerce by establishing early logistical and administrative systems that could manage distant operations efficiently. Its use of detailed record-keeping, organized shipping schedules, and coordinated trade networks became a template for later corporations and colonial administrations. The VOC's example showed that comprehensive planning and disciplined execution were critical to operating on a global scale. Ultimately, the story of the VOC is a tale of ambition, innovation, and hubris. Its creation marked the birth of multinational enterprise, its expansion reshaped global trade, and its collapse highlighted the limits of corporate power when confronted with corruption, inefficiency, and changing geopolitical realities. Modern corporations continue to grapple with many of the same challenges the VOC faced, balancing profit with oversight, managing complex international operations, navigating political and market volatility, and maintaining public trust. In this way, the VOC's experience remains a cautionary yet inspiring chapter in the history of global business. The rise and sudden fall of the Dutch East India Company serve as a historical lens through which we can understand the dynamics of power, commerce, and human ambition. It reminds us that while corporations can shape the world in extraordinary ways, their survival depends not just on wealth and strategy, but on governance, adaptability, and integrity. The VOC's story endures as a testament to the transformative and sometimes precarious power of global enterprise.